Okay, let's unpack this. Picture the scenario. It's the early 7th century. You've got this brand new state, really a political experiment, that's been carved out of what was essentially tribal anarchy. And it is just struggling to survive.
Right. And its whole structure isn't based on a single faith, not at all. It's defined by this very delicate contract, this agreement between all these different religious and ethnic groups.
Exactly. And then, boom, a violent crime happens. A member of the minority community is murdered. And the accused is from the majority faith.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, this isn't just a crime anymore, is it? It's the ultimate test. It's an existential crisis for that tiny, fledgling state.
It absolutely is. The question becomes, does it fall back on old habits, on tribal loyalty? Does it favor its own people? Or does it choose something much, much harder?
The daunting path of absolute impartial law.
That moment, that choice right there between law and blood, that is the crucible of statehood. And it's precisely what we're going to be exploring today.
We're going to be focusing on a single, and I mean massively influential, legal precedent from early Medina. It's a case that really set a standard for equal protection that becomes a cornerstone for jurisprudence later on.
It really does.
Absolutely. So our mission in this deep dive is to go beyond just the summary of what happened. We want to extract the rich, the operational insights from what the sources call the case of the Jewish goldsmith.
Right. We're not just looking at the verdict. We're looking at how they got there. How is this abstract idea of rule of law so aggressively, so politically, and even spiritually enforced to guarantee equality in that brand new community?
To do that, we're relying on some very focused source material. We'll be working with excerpts from Justice and the Jewish Goldsmith, Rule of Law in Medina.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of a wider series called Islamic Legal Precedents, Judgements of Prophet Muhammad.
And the clarity in these sources is what lets us really analyze the whole thing, not just the outcome, but the meticulous step-by-step process that led to it.
Which brings us to the big question, the one that makes this whole story resonate across, 14 centuries?
Yeah.
How did the Prophet Muhammad Diki, acting as the supreme executive and judge of this incredibly diverse, high-tension political entity, how did he manage to establish a state that was governed purely by universal law?
And in doing so, systematically overriding generations of ingrained tribal loyalties. I mean, avoiding that trap of faith-based bias, especially when faced with something as charged as a murder case.
It was, for all intents and purposes, a constitutional moment that just happened to be disguised as a criminal trial.
That's a great way to put it.
It was a huge transition point. You have to remember, we're moving from a world where justice was, well, it was mediated by your kinship ties, it was paid for with blood money, and the amount depended entirely on your social status. That was the norm across pre-Islamic Arabia.
And this case represents the shift away from that.
Completely. It's a shift to a system based on universal, codified law and a state contract. In understanding that shift in legal philosophy, that takes us directly into part one, the context. We need to understand Medina and the covenant that held it all together.
Right. Because if you just parachute into this story without understanding the social dynamics, you miss the incredible tension of the whole situation.
Yeah.
The sources are so clear on this. This was not a monolithic community.
Not even close. It was a dramatically pluralistic society.
So what did that actually look like on a day-to-day basis? Who were the main groups?
Well, Medina was a crucible, really. You had the early Muslim community, which itself was split into two groups. The Muhajirun, who were the migrants from Mecca, and the Ansar, the local helpers in Medina.
Okay, so there's division even within the Muslim group.
Absolutely. Then you had several prominent and powerful Jewish tribes who had been there for a very long time. And on top of that, various other pagan and tribal groups with their own traditions and allegiances.
Governing that sounds like a nightmare.
It was incredibly complex. And that's probably why the Prophet's initial goal wasn't religious uniformity. It couldn't be. The goal had to be civic stability.
So how do you achieve that?
You have to replace the old laws, the arbitrary, often violent laws of retaliation that were based purely on whether the victim was your kinsman. That system had to go completely.
So for stability, you need a new document, an overarching framework that could function like an operating system for the entire state, no matter what faith you followed.
And that is the Mithaq-e-Madinah, the famous Charter of Madinah.
The charter is the absolute linchpin of this entire discussion, isn't it?
It's everything. It was the single binding social covenant that legally unified all of these disparate groups. Before the charter, you had a collection of tribes. After the charter, you had a single political community. an ummah.
An ummah defined by citizenship, not by faith.
Precisely. It was defined by shared obligations, mutual defense guarantees,
Hmm.
not by a shared religious doctrine.
If you look at it through a modern lens, it's fascinating. This charter established the core function of the state right from the very beginning. The goal was to be governed by law.
Right. It wasn't about enforcing a single faith. It was about creating an impartial legal structure where the safety and property rights of, say, the weakest citizen were just as sacrosanct as those of the most powerful leader.
And that standard of impartiality is what the state, through the Prophet committed to upholding.
It had to. Think about it. If the law was just a tool for the majority to enforce its will, why would the Jewish tribes or any other non-Muslim group have any incentive to participate in this political experiment?
Can't have zero incentive.
None. The legal system had to demonstrate without any qualification that Muslim and non-Muslim citizens stood equally subject to the law's punishments and, just as importantly, equally entitled to the law's protections.
And that context just gives this murder case such enormous weight.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't some isolated criminal act. It was the moment where the theoretical promise of the charter slammed into the brutal reality of human violence.
Exactly. And that sets the stage perfectly for the dramatic showdown in Part 2. The incident, the murder, and the societal tension that followed.
Let's get into the specifics of the crime because the details here really, really matter for the legal analysis that follows. The sources identify the victim as a Jewish goldsmith.
That description is very telling. A goldsmith is, by definition, an individual of visible wealth, and that often makes them highly vulnerable.
And the perpetrator?
The sources confirm the perpetrator was a Muslim man, and critically, the motive was specified. It was purely for his wealth.
Okay, so that's crucial. This wasn't an act of political uprising or religious zealotry or even some old tribal feud seeking revenge.
No, it was simple, cold-blooded, premeditated robbery that ended in murder.
And stripping away all those other potential justifications, that focuses the entire legal process onto one single question, doesn't it?
It does. Can the state deliver justice equally?
That focus is what made the atmosphere in Medina so charged. The sources really emphasize this part, that everyone was watching.
Oh, absolutely. The various Jewish tribes, the pagan groups, the newly converted Muslims, they were all waiting to see if their leader would succumb to that age-old pressure of favoring his co-religionist over a minority citizen.
This was the moment of crystallization then, where the abstract rhetoric of the charter either hardens into concrete law
Or it just dissolves entirely, crumbles into dust.
So here's where the high-stakes risk becomes so palpable. Let's say, for the sake of argument, the Prophet had chosen loyalty. If he'd favored the Muslim, what specific immediate consequences would the sources suggest might have happened?
The immediate consequence would have been, well, disastrous for the entire state structure.
How so?
The foundation of mutual trust, the political glue that the Mithaq-e-Madinah provided, would have instantly evaporated.
So the non-Muslim tribes, especially the Jewish tribes, who held, you mentioned, significant economic power and had their own history and alliances.
They would have concluded, and rightly so, that their lives were valued at a discount, that their safety wasn't guaranteed by the state, only by their own strength.
And what would that conclusion have led to, practically speaking?
A swift shift from cooperation to antagonism.
Yep.
You have to remember the geopolitical environment. They were under constant threat from their adversaries in Mecca.
Right, they couldn't afford internal division.
Not at all. Any internal conflict, any rebellion, or even just a refusal by the minority groups to honor their defense obligations under the Charter would have exposed Medina to complete external destruction.
So the need for absolute impartiality it wasn't just some lofty moral choice.
No, it was an existential requirement. It was about the survival of the state itself.
In other words, the survival of the entire Madinah project hinged on the unbiased application of justice in this single case of murder.
Mm-hmm. The ruling had to unequivocally validate the principle that the sanctity of life for all citizens was completely non-negotiable, regardless of who the murderer was.
It had to demonstrate to every single person in that city, whether they worshipped in a mosque, a synagogue, or, worshipped idols, that their citizenship is what defined their value before the law. That it trumped faith, it trumped tribe, it trumped social standing.
The legal system had to be utterly blind in this case, or the Madinah state was fundamentally doomed from the start.
The pressure must have been just immense.
Unimaginable.
And that intensity brings us right to Part 3. The inquiry and the execution of justice. This is where we look past the final verdict and really analyze the due process that gave the ruling its legitimacy.
Yes, and the focus on the rigor of the investigation is absolutely critical here. It's what prevents the ruling from being dismissed as, say, a mere political convenience. The sources are specific. The prophet Zika personally led the inquiry.
What does that actually look like? Personally led the inquiry in 7th century Medina. We know he wasn't just delegating this politically explosive case, but what specific investigative steps would he have taken to verify witnesses, to verify motives, and ensure the highest possible standard of investigation?
That's a crucial question, because in that period, you're lacking modern forensic science.
Right.
So the rigor lay almost entirely in the comprehensive gathering and, importantly, the challenging of testimony.
So when the sources say he personally led it,
It implies he was using the highest executive authority of the state to guarantee complete impartiality and thoroughness.
can you break that down? What would those steps be?
Well, there would be several key steps. First, securing consistent testimony from multiple witnesses, and not just taking it at face value, but cross-examining them, looking for discrepancies that might indicate they'd been coached or there was tribal pressure at play.
Okay, so witness verification. What else?
Second, verifying the context. You'd assess the victim's occupation, a goldsmith, and his known wealth against the known circumstances of the accused. Was the accused in debt? Was there a history of greed? You're building a profile of the motive,
And third.
actively pursuing any mitigating factors. Because the prophet, he understood the immense political consequences of this ruling, he had to be absolutely certain the evidence was incontrovertible. He was acting as the supreme investigator, ensuring that any finding of guilt could withstand any scrutiny, especially from those within his own community who would naturally want to protect the Muslim perpetrator.
So the state was putting its full weight behind a thorough, unbiased investigation into the murder of a minority citizen. This wasn't old-school tribal justice.
Not at all. This was nascent state jurisprudence in action.
And that rigorous process, it led to an unassailable conclusion.
Yes. The evidence confirmed the Muslim's guilt, ruling out any reasonable possibility of error or bias.
And then comes the firm ruling. This is the moment where the law isn't just stated, it's imbued with a kind of spiritual authority.
It had to be. The ruling needed to do two things at once: deliver justice in the here and now, and establish an enduring precedent that resonated deeply within the conscience of the majority community.
And the Prophet achieves this by connecting the legal violation directly to a grave spiritual consequence.
The specific quote from the sources used to reinforce this is, "It's devastatingly powerful," and it's cited in legal texts for centuries after. He says, "Whoever kills a person with whom we have a treaty shall not smell the fragrance of paradise."
Wow. I mean, that is a staggering weight to place on a legal covenant.
It is. It immediately elevates the protection of a non-Muslim citizen, the one with whom we have a treaty, to the highest possible spiritual obligation a Muslim can have.
It's strategic brilliance, really.
It is. He's telling the entire Muslim community in the most unequivocal terms that adherence to this political contract, this respect for the lives and rights of other citizens under that treaty, it's not just a societal courtesy, it's a fundamental component of your faith.
By treating the violation of the Mithaq-e-Madinah as a spiritual catastrophe, he's preactively neutralizing any future attempts to claim some kind of religious exemption or superiority when committing crimes against protected minorities.
Exactly. This statement fundamentally blocks any argument for leniency based on a shared faith. The punishment had to be absolutely equivalent, impartial, and public to serve as both a deterrent and an affirmation of the Charter.
And so the legal consequence followed that spiritual mandate.
It did. The sources confirm the accused was executed in qisās for the murder of the Jewish citizen.
Let's dedicate a moment to clarifying qisās right here. In this context, it means legal retribution or equivalence, the fundamental principle of a life for a life. But what does its application by the state, in this specific manner, truly signify about the status of the goldsmith?
It signifies complete and total legal parity.
As opposed to what?
Well, in pre-Islamic Arabia, and frankly in many other systems of the time, the daya, or blood money, for a non-tribesman or a member of a minority group was often less than that for a freeborn member of the dominant tribe. It was a tiered system.
So using qisās here?
The use of qisās, which mandates equivalence in kind, a life for a life, demonstrated that the life of the Jewish goldsmith was valued precisely the same as the life of the Muslim perpetrator.
There was no discount.
None. The state applied the most severe penalty possible to one of its own members, specifically to validate the foundational rights of a minority citizen. It was the absolute, non-negotiable public ratification of the Charter.
The implication being that the state wasn't just, facilitating a private vendetta.
Right.
It was taking official responsibility for the execution to ensure the continuity of its core legal principle.
Precisely. The state was the plaintiff. It was acting on behalf of the victim and on behalf of the covenant itself. This act wasn't about mercy. It was about pure, unadulterated justice, administered without the slightest hint of prejudice based on identity.
Which transitions us perfectly into part 4, where we can really dissect the ratio decidendi, the enduring legal principles that make this case such a cornerstone of Islamic public law.
The first, and I would argue the most revolutionary principle to come out of this, is that the administration of justice is religion blind.
And this wasn't just a polite political concession, a nice idea. It was a concrete, and as we've seen, an enforceable legal declaration. How did this ruling really ensure that a Muslim and a non-Muslim stood truly and equally before the law?
It did it by establishing that citizenship, which was defined by the Charter, superseded religious identity in all matters of criminal justice. This case confirmed that the law provides no religious or tribal immunity for a crime.
So if you are a citizen under the state's protection,
Then your relationship to the justice system is defined by that contract, not by your internal beliefs. A crime is a crime, period, irrespective of the identities involved.
think about the alternatives.
Exactly. If the ruling had favored the Muslim, it would have immediately created a two-tiered system where justice was weighted by faith. By applying qisās equally, the Prophet mandated a single, universal legal standard for everyone under his protection.
And tied directly to that idea of equality is the second principle, the universal sanctity of life. This really goes against the historical grain of many contemporary empires at the time, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Right.
While sure, many societies had rules against arbitrary murder, those rules were often indexed to your social status.
Right, we talked about that with the blood money.
This Madinah ruling introduced a concept of inherent, universal worth for human life, as long as it was under state protection. The source material captures this essence in a really powerful statement that became the core legal reasoning for the decision.
Which is?
The sanctity of life is universal. No faith grants immunity from justice.
So if the state protects you, your life has inherent worth simply by virtue of being under that protection. How did this principle practically change the legal calculation compared to the old tribal systems it replaced?
Well, in pre-Islamic customary law, if a man of, say, lower status killed a man of higher status, he was certainly killed, no question.
Hmm.
But if a man of higher status killed a man of lower status, it was often settled by an amount of diya that might be reduced, or even refused altogether. The system was designed to maintain the social hierarchy.
And this ruling just demolishes that.
It completely abolishes that discriminatory indexing. By mandating qisās for the murder of the Jewish Goldsmith, the state decreed that all lives under the contract were legally equal. It was a radical departure.
That sets up the third principle then, the specific protection of the dhimmi. We should probably make sure we fully understand the nuance of this legal designation.
Right. The term dhimmi, it translates essentially to protected people, or people of the covenant.
So it's not a pejorative term.
Not at all. In this legal context, it's a formalized legal status. It was granted to non-Muslims who accepted the governance of the Islamic State under the terms laid out in the Mithaq-e-Madinah.
So the charter wasn't just a general promise of "will be nice." It detailed specific guarantees.
Very specific.
What did the protection afforded by the charter specifically include for the dhimmi?
It guaranteed complete religious freedom, for one, autonomy over their own internal legal affairs, things like family law and inheritance. And most critically for this case, the absolute protection of their life, their property, and their honor by the state's full military and legal machinery.
And what was their obligation in return?
In exchange, they accepted certain obligations. The most well-known is the jizya, or poll tax, which was paid in lieu of performing military service. That tax effectively funded the state's commitment to protect them. The contract was explicit, and it was binding on both sides.
And this judgment established just how severe a violation of this contract was. Violating a dhimmi's rights, especially their right to life, was treated as violating a divine command. We saw that with the fragrance of paradise quote.
That structural protection is vital. By framing the protection as something divinely mandated, the ruling built a permanent legal firewall against any majoritarian impulse. The majority community was held to the highest possible standard of accountability.
And the murder of the goldsmith proved that the state would use its full power, both spiritual and temporal, to enforce that protection.
Even if it meant executing a member of the majority faith.
This ruling really cemented the idea that the state's legitimacy comes from its ability to protect the vulnerable, not just satisfy the powerful.
Precisely. This ruling served as the highest form of legal security that was possible at the time.
Okay, so now that we've established a precedent, let's explore part 5, the enduring impact and modern reflection. Because this single case didn't just resolve a local dispute, it became the core foundation of CR, which is Islamic public law.
That's right. CR is the body of law that governs things like international relations and, crucially, the rights of non-Muslims, whether they are foreign residents or internal citizens of the state.
And why did this case become so foundational?
Because it dealt directly with that foundational question of citizenship, equality, and protection. It became the go-to reference point for all subsequent governance in this area. It provided the intellectual template for how to integrate and protect diverse populations across the rapidly expanding Islamic empire.
So this wasn't just some isolated historical footnote, it was actually institutionalized. We need to see how this legal precedent cascaded down and influenced the successive caliphs. Can you give us some concrete examples of how they applied this Madinah precedent?
Yes, the sources explicitly highlight the impact on the Rashidun caliphs, the first 4 successors. Notably Umar ibn al-Khattab R.A. and Ali ibn Abi Talib R.A.
Let's start with Umar.
Caliph Umar ruled over a massive, newly conquered territory that was incredibly diverse, and he frequently referenced this principle. There's a key anecdote that involves a high-ranking Muslim official who mistreated a dhimmi citizen. The sources indicate the official, who was a governor, may have struck or violated the property of a Christian citizen in Egypt. When the complaint reached Umar in Medina, he immediately ordered that the official be subjected to qisās.
So not execution in this case, but...
Not execution, but equal physical retribution.
Yeah.
He ordered that it be carried out by the injured party themselves in public. Umar's message was crystal clear. There is no immunity for abuse of power against a protected citizen. Your rank doesn't save you.
That is a staggering commitment to the principle.
Yeah.
Even the state's own elite officials were not shielded when dealing with minority citizens.
Exactly. And you see a similar pattern with Caliph Ali ibn Abi Talib. He was faced with a case in Kufa involving a Jewish citizen whose armor had been stolen.
And
Ali personally pursued the case against the Muslim thief, and it turned out that the thief was later confirmed to be the caliph's own governor.
his own governor.
Yes. And despite that, Ali ensured that the judicial process remained absolutely impartial. He treated the Jewish plaintiff with the same deference and rigor as if he were a high-ranking Muslim. These successive judgments show that the principle from the Goldsmith case was thoroughly baked into the legal operating system.
It ensured continuity and accountability long after the initial ruling.
It did. And this historical chain really demonstrates that the core principle equality of life before the law was non-negotiable, even when the state's power was at its absolute zenith. It became the defining moral standard for governance.
It ensured that the Islamic legal system offered robust protection to non-Muslims. And that fundamentally distinguished its legal system from others that often relegated religious minorities to a status far beneath that of the dominant faith. Now, let's try to bring this ancient precedent into a contemporary context. Because the principles established here, sanctity of life, equal protection, they are instantly recognizable to anyone who's familiar with modern constitutional law.
Absolutely. The historical ruling is a striking reflection of the principle of equal protection of law that is foundational to pretty much all modern democracies.
The idea that the state must treat all citizens equally and cannot discriminate based on identity.
Right. That concept is not some recent Western invention. It has deep, deep roots in historical legal systems, and this case is a prime example of that.
And the sources draw a specific contemporary line for us, connecting this historical event directly to Article 25 of Pakistan's constitution. Why that specific legal connection? What's the significance there?
Well, Article 25 guarantees that all citizens are equal before law and are entitled to equal protection of law. The reason the sources highlight this is to demonstrate the enduring nature of the legal tension that was first faced in Medina.
What tension is that?
The tension that modern states, especially those with official state religions or deeply intertwined religious and cultural identities, still struggle mightily with. How do you reconcile faith with state law? How do you ensure equality for all?
And the Goldsmith case provides a historical answer.
It provides a powerful one. The legal mandate of the state must prioritize equality and the protection of life above all else. It must ensure that identity does not factor into criminal justice. Article 25 is, in essence, a modern restatement of the operative legal principle established when that Muslim killer was executed for murdering the Jewish citizen.
So it grounds the modern idea of constitutional equality in a historical moment of profound spiritual and legal consequence.
Exactly. It shows continuity of a principle.
That's a powerful synthesis. This entire case, the murder, the meticulous due process, the implementation of qisās, it's all distilled into a singular, overarching moral and legal synthesis in the source material.
It is. The moral synthesis is that justice in Islam knows no religion, color, or class, because it is the reflection of divine mercy on earth.
So the justice system is seen as the tangible mechanism.
The mechanism through which the divine mandate for fairness and impartiality is enacted on earth. It places the burden of proof not on the victim but on the state itself to maintain absolute righteousness in its application of the law.
So, after all this, what does it all mean for us today, for you, the listener, diving deep into this history? We've traced a pivotal crime in a brand new state. We've watched it become a political flashpoint, and we've seen how the rigorous, impartial application of law established a foundational principle that defined centuries of jurisprudence.
It's an exemplary case study in legal leadership, really. Leadership during a moment of supreme, intense pressure.
It demonstrates that true rule of law isn't measured by the statutes you write down on paper,
But by the state's political courage to enforce those laws against its own powerful or majority members, especially when it's for the protection of the rights of a minority.
when the state uses its ultimate authority to ensure the life of a minority citizen is valued equally, it achieves an immediate, profound, and lasting legitimacy.
It absolutely does.
And it underscores that any political system that rests on a pluralistic contract, like the Charter of Madinah, must have that contract continually validated through robust, unbiased enforcement whenever violence or corruption threatens it. You can't just take the commitment to equality for granted.
The sanctity of that covenant was paramount. Once you entered into a treaty with the state, your rights, your property, and your life were protected by the full, combined spiritual and legal authority of that state.
And the violation of that protection, as the Jewish Goldsmith case so clearly demonstrated, could not be excused, regardless of the faith or the influence of the person who committed the crime.
Exactly.
So as we conclude this deep dive, let's leave you with one final thought to mull over, building on the profound implications of this historical precedent. We've established that the stability and legitimacy of a political system are immediately and acutely tested by its ability to grant equal justice to its most vulnerable or minority citizens, as the Prophet Muhammad did in the case of the Jewish Goldsmith. If that historical pattern holds true, that the strength of a government is defined not by how it treats its strongest, but how ruthlessly it protects its weakest, what immediate and tangible systemic change does that realization demand of current political leaders and legal systems around the world, particularly those currently struggling to balance majority demographics with minority rights and protection?
The message echoing from Medina all those centuries ago is that justice cannot merely be equitable in theory. It must be demonstrably, unequivocally equal in its application, especially when the test involves the ultimate sacrifice of execution. That is the cost of legitimate governance.
Something to think about. Thank you for diving deep with us today.